In London 1803, a scientist achieved the impossible. The corpse of a hanged man was reanimated in front of a small crowd of spectators. The following is a description of the event as it was reported in the Morning Post of the 22nd of January. On the first application of the process to the face, the jaws of the deceased criminal began to quiver, and the adjoining muscles were horribly contorted, and one eye was actually opened. In the subsequent part of the process, the right hand was raised and clenched, and the legs and thighs were set in motion. The story of Frankenstein is a masterpiece of Gothic literature. It combines horror, romance, tragedy, and of course, the holy grail of being able to bring the dead back to life. It's one of the most memorable and recognisable stories ever told, but it's based on real events that are more tragic and horrific than anyone could imagine. And this is what makes it the perfect accompaniment for the Halloween season. Welcome to Paranormal FM, your home with the strange, unexplained, and all things that go bump in the night. If that sounds like the kind of thing you enjoy, then give this episode a like and subscribe for more content. This is the true story of Frankenstein. It's 1802 in London, England, and Italian professor Giovanni Aldini wants the perfect body, or more precisely, the perfect corpse. They need to be healthy when they die. Any sickness will ruin the experiment and weaken the body's ability to reanimate. They can't have any missing body parts either. This will complicate things. No, what he needs is a young, healthy person who has died of unnatural causes. But most importantly, they need to have died recently. The fresher the corpse, the better. He's only just arrived in London, and he's not there for the great British weather. He's there for the fresh corpses the capital can provide him. Just over half a century earlier, in 1751, England passed the Murder Act, which forbade the burial of anyone convicted of murder. Instead, their corpses would be used for experimentation, all in the name of scientific discovery. The dissection of corpses is a taboo subject at the time. It's believed that the body needs to be intact for the soul's resurrection on Judgment Day. But as the souls of murderers are destined for an eternity of flaming torment anyway, the desecration of their corpse is less of a concern. It's also seen as an added deterrent to would-be murderers, and the penalty for anyone convicted of murder is death by hanging, followed by surgical experimentation. This provides Aldini the perfect opportunity to access the kind of corpse he needs for his experiments. Around this time, Aldini is somewhat of a rising star in Europe's science community. His uncle, Luigi Galvani, invented the famous experiment of using electricity to make a frog's legs twitch, an experiment familiar to some schoolchildren, and a technique known as the Galvanic technique. But Aldini decides to take things to a whole new level. He spends a year in Bologna and Paris perfecting his technique. He reanimates the bodies of dogs, oxen and horses, and while in Paris, he gets his hands on 2 human corpses. There's just one problem. They've both been decapitated, but nonetheless, he uses them to put his theory into practice. He places the 2 heads on separate tables, and after connecting them with an arc of electricity, the faces snarl and grimace at the horrified spectators. The pinnacle of the performance is when he makes one of the headless corpses clutch a coin and throw it into the crowd. But despite the success of his experiments, he still has his detractors, and he knows that the only way to silence them is to reanimate a human corpse. But for that, he needs a corpse that still has its head attached. And the best place to find that is England. So, in 1802, he arrives in London. Then, in December that year, the drowned bodies of a mother and her child are found in Paddington Canal, and the man suspected of their murder has already been arrested. It looks like Aldini could be getting his test subject sooner than he thinks. It's Monday morning on the 6th of December 1802. It's a typically cold and frosty morning in the capital. Dawn has only just broken, and the frost from the night before still cakes the ground in a delicate white dusting. But someone is about to make a gruesome discovery that will set in motion a horrific chain of events. Most Londoners are still warm in bed, but not John Atkins, a boatman working for the Grand Union Canal. He's preparing his barge for the commuters he'll be transporting up the Thames in a few short hours. He steps onto the barge and hears a gentle thud against its hull. He looks into the water, expecting to see a small log or some other form of driftwood, but instead he sees a small ice-covered doll that's somehow lodged under the bow. It's only when he pulls it out the water that he comes to the horrific realization that this is no doll, but the lifeless body of a baby girl. He tells the authorities immediately and is instructed to dredge the canal to see if there are more bodies. And 3 days later, they find the body of a woman entangled in a submerged bush by the window of Mitre Tavern. The woman is identified as 34-year-old Jane Foster, and the baby girl was her daughter, Louisa. They were last seen in the company of an unknown man, and 3 weeks later, just after Christmas, that man is arrested for their murder. His name is George Foster. The dead woman and baby girl were his wife and daughter. The trial is scheduled for January the 14th, 1803. It would be a trial filled with controversy, hidden evidence, and culminate with the death and subsequent desecration of a potentially innocent man. In his statement, George Foster claims that he left his wife and child at the Mitre Tavern to see his other 2 children who were in a workhouse in Barnet. He says they were alive when he left them, although his wife was a little in liquor. In other words, she was drunk. The implication being that his wife had fallen into the canal by accident with their daughter due to the large amount of alcohol she'd had to drink. But there's 2 big problems with this account. Firstly, he claims to have walked a total of nearly 20 miles in just an hour and a half. This wasn't possible. It takes an experienced hiker 3 hours to walk that distance. And the second problem with this story is that despite his claims to have left his wife and child at the Mitre Tavern, a waiter and landlady at the tavern claimed to have seen them leaving together, and multiple other witnesses saw them walking along the canal after they left Mitre Tavern. The prosecution puts together a timeline of events based on eyewitness testimony that goes something like this. On Saturday the 4th, Jane and Louise Foster arrived at George Foster's lodging house and stayed the night. At some point during the evening, George and Jane Foster are overheard by his landlord having an argument about money. Apparently, this isn't unusual, as Jane would come by at least once or twice a week asking for money from him. They all left together at 10 a.m. the following day, which would have been Sunday the 5th of December, and throughout the day they were seen at multiple taverns, as well as walking together along the canal. When George Foster returned to his lodging late that evening, he returned alone. The following day, on Monday the 6th of December, the drowned body of baby Louisa Foster was discovered, and Jane Foster was found 3 days later. It's asserted that at some point on Sunday evening, George Foster drowned his wife and child in the canal. The prosecution's case rests on the inconsistencies in Foster's testimony, namely that he lied about walking from Mitre to Barnet, and during the course of the trial it emerged that he also lied about his wife asking the mistress at the Mitre Tavern for a bed for the night. They argue that this was proof that Foster was lying to cover up his crimes. The jury agrees and return with a verdict of guilty. Foster is sentenced to hang until dead and have his body handed over to surgeons for dissection. And there just so happens to be a surgeon in London who was very interested in George Foster, a surgeon by the name of Giovanni Aldini. On the 17th of January 1803, at 3 minutes to 8 in the morning, George Foster was brought out from Newgate to his place of execution. He wore the same brown greatcoat, buttoned over a red waistcoat, that he'd worn throughout his trial. He hasn't eaten since his conviction, and is now so weak that he's unable to climb the steps of the gallows without assistance. A reporter from Bell's Weekly Messenger writes that when he ascended the platform, his air was dejected in the extreme, and the sorrow manifested in his countenance depicted the inwards working of a heart conscious of the heinous crime he had committed and the justness of his sentence. Just before the noose is placed around his neck, George Foster confesses to the murder of his wife and child. He says that he had unhappily conceived a most inveterate hatred for his wife that nothing could conquer, and determined to rid himself and the world of a being he loathed. In fact, he says he's taken her to the canal twice before with the intention of drowning her, but his nerve failed him both times. When he's asked if jealousy has anything to do with his decision to kill her, he simply replied that he ought to die. Then, following a short prayer, the noose is tightened, the cap is pulled over his eyes, and the floor falls from beneath his feet. And with that, the life of George Foster ends. For now, at least. But, despite the conviction, questions remain about George Foster's guilt. After all, he was convicted on circumstantial evidence. No one actually saw him drown his wife and child, and there is evidence to suggest that Jane Foster could have committed suicide and drowned Louisa in the process. There are even suggestions that his confession was coerced out of him. A friend of Jane Foster, by the name of Anne Arnold, reported that in the days leading up to her death, she was talking about ending her own life and that of her daughter. She was recorded as saying things like, "If we die together," and that if something wasn't done for her, meaning her daughter, she would put an end to her misery. This was also confirmed by Eleanor Decker, who was at the Arnold home when this conversation took place, and when she left, they were both concerned about Jane Foster's well-being. But perhaps the most important piece of evidence was the Middlesex coroner's report that delivered a verdict of accidental death on both Jane and Louisa Foster. They were later examined by a surgeon who came to the same conclusion, and they both stated that there were absolutely no signs of violence on either of the bodies. But for some reason, this evidence was left out of the trial. Rumours circulated that perhaps George Foster had been set up, and that the court officer in charge of proceedings, a man called Mr. Pass, was being paid by Aldini to fast-track the trial so he could obtain a fresh corpse. Nonetheless, it was all too late for Foster, and after being cut down, his body is driven to a house where a certain Professor Giovanni Aldini is eagerly expecting its arrival. What happens next is one of the most terrifying experiments ever recorded. The room is crowded with scientists, reporters, and members of high society. The hushed murmurs of excitement, incredulity, and even fear fill the room. Prior to the experiment, it's agreed that if Aldini succeeds in bringing George Foster back to life, then Foster will need to be executed a second time. Assisting Aldini is Joe Carpui, a fellow surgeon, and Mr. Pass, the same Mr. Pass who was rumoured to have fast-tracked the trial of the now dead man laying before them on the operating table. Aldini now has his body, but he hasn't had it all his own way. The day is cold, really cold. Foster was left hanging for over an hour in sub-zero temperatures. Aldini's never performed this experiment on a corpse that was kept in such cold conditions, and now he's worried. He's worried about damage to the tissue, and he's concerned that the coldness of the body will inhibit the flow of electricity. If this happened, the experiment would fail, and Aldini would become a laughingstock. But even worse, it would ruin his uncle's legacy, and prove that his critics were right all along. Aldini takes a deep breath and begins. He starts by wetting the ends of 2 metal wires by dipping them in salt water. The room falls silent in anticipation, and Aldini hears his heart beating in his ears. He sees his hands are shaking, so he takes another deep breath to steady them. It's all come down to this. He threads them carefully into Foster's ears, and the results are horrifying. Foster's mouth starts to quiver, his face contorts and grimaces in pain. Then, all of a sudden, one of his eyes open and stares grotesquely at the shocked observers. Some applaud enthusiastically, but others can only stare, dumbstruck and horrified by what they're witnessing. But Aldini isn't done yet. He moves on to the next part of the experiment, and Foster suddenly raises his right arm in the air and clenches his hand into a fist. Then his legs begin to move. Gasps and shrieks of terror fill the auditorium. Some people faint. No one is applauding anymore. Aldini removes the wires, and as he withdraws them from the body, it contorts once more, then rests back on the table. After this, the body doesn't move again. Aldini didn't succeed in bringing George Foster back to life, but his work set the groundwork for the invention of a device that has brought countless others back from the dead. It's a device you probably know as a defibrillator. As a side note, Mr. Pass, who we talked about earlier, was reported as being so shocked by what he saw that he went home and died of fright that very night. He wasn't resurrected either. As to whether or not he interfered in George Foster's trial, we'll probably never know for sure. But if he did, it makes for a very ironic twist in the story. The prospect of bringing the dead back to life is something that fascinates and terrifies us in equal measure. And Frankenstein is a story that asks, if it could be done, should it be done? There are some that believe we are born with a soul, and when we die, the soul leaves the body. How the soul is defined has been a subject of debate for centuries, but it's generally agreed to be the essence of who we are. This includes things like personality, conscience, and morality. But this belief also implies that when someone is brought back to life, their now departed soul does not come with them. So, instead of a beloved friend, spouse, or child returning to us, instead what we get is a soulless entity, devoid of humanity. It's a trope explored in countless stories and movies about the undead, and it forces us to ask important questions, not only about our mortality, but also our morality. This is one of the many reasons I love horror. It forces us to explore the darkest corners of our psyche, and makes us question if our desires are something that are worth pursuing. In the case of Frankenstein, the question is, just because you can play God, does it mean that you should? Happy Halloween from everyone at Paranormal FM, which is me. Still, try not to raise the dead.